The movie starts by showing the calm life of a man named George Vickers and his wife Sandra in a fancy house. They seemed really happy together. That day, they were eagerly waiting for their son, Jimmy Vickers, who had been a soldier in Afghanistan. He was finally coming home after a long time away. Sandra was getting ready to welcome him. At the same time, some bad guys on the edge of town were planning to rob a woman they had been targeting for a while. They were sitting in their car, using illegal drugs, and waiting for the woman. When she left the bank, they put on their masks and followed her. They stopped her car under the bridge and demanded the money she got from the bank. The woman was scared and said she didn't know what money they were talking about. One of the thieves looked through the car but didn't find anything. Since they couldn't find the money they wanted, one of them suggested taking the woman as a hostage. But then George, who happened to be passing by, stopped them. He tried to scare the thieves off, but one of them, Josh, didn't listen and hit George with a baseball bat. George's left hand got hurt in the attack, but he managed to grab the bat and hit Josh back until Josh passed out. Soon after, they heard police sirens, so the thieves ran away, leaving Josh behind. Before they left, one of them threatened George. When George saw Josh lying in a pool of blood, he realized how serious the situation was. When the police arrived, they treated George's injured arm and asked him what happened. Detective Spencer Holland arrived and said that Josh had died from the blow George gave him. Even though George was only defending himself, Spencer arrested him for attempted murder, which shocked George. After the escaping robbers returned to the gang leader Warren Evans' place, things were intense. Some people were doing drugs while others were packing them for selling. When Warren heard about the failed robbery and his brother Josh's death, he was furious. He couldn't accept his brother's death and ordered his men to kill George, the man who had fought back. That night, Warren and his crew, Caleb, Danny, Rob, and Ryan, stalked George and his wife as they came back home. They attacked the couple as soon as they reached their house, leaving them helpless. After tying them up, Warren and his gang filmed George and Sandra. They then poured gasoline on them and set their house on fire before leaving. The day after Jimmy returned from Afghanistan, he was heartbroken to learn about his parents' tragic death at home. Back at his apartment, his friend Griff, who worked as a cop, called to offer his condolences and support in investigating the murder. Wanting to find out more, Jimmy went to a nearby bar to ask the bartender, Terry Grobbs, about what happened to his parents. But Terry seemed scared and hesitant to talk, fearing the local gangsters. Jimmy got frustrated and caused a scene, prompting Terry to reveal that he heard his parents screaming on the night of the incident and saw 4 men leaving the house as a fire started. Terry didn't want any trouble with the gangsters and only called the fire department. After learning from Terry, Jimmy went to his parents' burnt-down house. Among the wreckage, he stumbled upon a photo of himself with his parents, which only added to his sadness at their sudden loss. Shortly after, Griff, concerned about his friend, arrived to console Jimmy. But Jimmy, refusing pity, demanded to know who was responsible for his parents' murder. Sadly, Griff couldn't offer much help as the police struggled to identify the culprits from the surveillance footage. Disheartened, Jimmy left, but Griff tried to encourage him before he went. The following day, Jimmy visited his parents' graves and then sought solace at a nearby church. Soon after, his wife Morgan arrived, attempting to console him. She mentioned sending him several emails to which he hadn't responded, but Jimmy explained he was on a military mission and couldn't reply. Concerned for Jimmy's well-being after losing his parents, Morgan took him home. However, their relationship had been strained for a while, and Jimmy remained distant. They had been considering divorce. Feeling there was nothing left to say, Jimmy decided to leave the church. Meanwhile, at Warren's hideout, a young couple arrived to buy drugs. Warren claimed they didn't have enough money, leading to the young man getting beaten. To obtain the drugs, the girl had to offer herself to Warren. One day, Jimmy was sitting in a cafe, sipping his coffee. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, noticing a man inside and another person across from him. When Griff called, Jimmy asked him to meet in his car. In the car, Griff shared details about Warren's car being spotted near Jimmy's parents' house on the night they were killed. He also mentioned how George had intervened in a robbery by Warren's gang and gave Jimmy a flash drive with surveillance footage from the robbery. That night, fueled by anger, Jimmy went to an address Griff had given him earlier. Meanwhile, Warren was at a gym working out. Jimmy waited outside for him. After finishing his workout, Warren left the gym and headed to his car. Just as he was getting in, Jimmy accidentally bumped into his car, sparking a confrontation. Suddenly, Jimmy jumped out of his car and brutally attacked Warren. He then covered Warren's head and took him somewhere. When Warren's head covering was removed, he found himself tied up in a car, shocked by what had happened. Jimmy demanded to know the names of his accomplices in his parents' murder. When Warren refused to talk, Jimmy threatened him by pouring gasoline around the car. Jimmy promised to let Warren go if he revealed the names, which scared Warren into confessing. However, despite getting the information, Jimmy didn't release Warren. Instead, he lit a cigarette and set the car on fire with Warren still inside. Feeling no remorse, Jimmy left and went to Morgan's house. They argued, and Jimmy decided to leave. As he got up, Morgan noticed a wound on his stomach and insisted on treating it before he left. Their tension eased as she tended to his wound. Morgan noticed Jimmy's severe injuries and asked what had happened, but he simply said it was complicated and hard to explain. She tried to understand and didn't press further. While being treated, Jimmy noticed divorce papers on the table and declared he wouldn't sign them, despite being the one who initially filed for divorce. This revelation made the atmosphere awkward again, prompting Jimmy to leave. However, Morgan offered him to stay the night, and eventually, they parted ways amicably. The next morning, Morgan was at a cafe where she saw a news report about a recent murder. Police and reporters were gathered at the scene of Warren's death. Meanwhile, Rob struggled to accept Warren's tragic demise. He confided in Ryan about Warren's death, which remained a mystery. Rob suspected Caleb of being the killer. That night, Rob and Ryan went to Caleb's house, pointing a gun at him, demanding answers about Warren's murder. Caleb denied any involvement in Warren's death, but his girlfriend intervened, pointing a gun at Rob and Ryan, forcing them to release Caleb. Caleb insisted he was innocent, warning them that if they ever found out he lied, they'd come for him. Meanwhile, Jimmy examined the surveillance footage from the flash drive Griff gave him, showing George helping a woman during a robbery. The sight enraged Jimmy further, fueling his desire for revenge for his parents' murder. He met with Griff to get information on the other killers, but Griff urged him to stop, warning of the dangers. Griff suggested handing the case to the police, but Jimmy refused, distrustful of the law enforcement system. He insisted on seeking revenge, believing it was the only justice for his parents' killers. With that, he left determined to take matters into his own hands. Once, Griff was assigned to investigate a robbery and murder case. He spoke to the victim's wife, Mrs. Gilbert, hoping to gather clues. When asked about the perpetrator's appearance, Mrs. Gilbert explained that she couldn't see clearly as the incident happened too fast. Frustrated by the lack of leads, Griff sought guidance from Spencer. However, Spencer's response disappointed him. He downplayed the seriousness of the case, suggesting it was just a regular robbery. Spencer even hinted that Mrs. Gilbert might benefit from her husband's life insurance. Griff was shocked to hear such words from a law enforcement officer meant to protect citizens. Caleb denied any role in Warren's death, but his girlfriend stepped in, aiming a gun at Rob and Ryan, forcing them to release Caleb. Caleb maintained his innocence, cautioning them that if he were lying, they'd come after him. Meanwhile, at a restaurant, Hanny was having lunch with colleagues discussing their business when he spotted Jimmy entering. Hanny, an old friend of Jimmy's with ties to illegal arms dealers, approached him. Jimmy asked Hanny for a weapon, and Hanny suggested meeting Trojan, who sold illegal firearms. Trojan showed them his selection, and Jimmy chose a gun with a silencer. Before Jimmy left, Hanny advised him to be cautious. With the weapon in hand, Jimmy followed another murderer, Danny, who was leaving his house for a bar. Inside the bar's restroom, Jimmy, wearing a mask, attacked Danny, rendering him unconscious. Shortly after, Jimmy took Danny, who had passed out, to a secluded location. When Danny regained consciousness and realized he was being held captive, Jimmy ominously declared that Danny would die that night. Danny was terrified, unable to comprehend why Jimmy wanted to kill him. Meanwhile, Rob, unable to locate Danny at the bar, called his phone, and Jimmy answered. He informed Rob that Danny would die that night, and Rob would follow suit soon after. Unfazed by Jimmy's threats, Rob challenged him to meet face-to-face. Jimmy accepted the challenge, feeling provoked by Rob's bravado. As the call ended, Jimmy began his plan, preparing cement mixed with water for Danny. Seeing this, Danny grew increasingly frightened, even urinating in fear. Jimmy then forced the cement mixture into Danny's mouth, causing a slow and agonizing death. The next day, police officers arrived at the scene of Danny's murder. Spencer, among them, was surprised to find that the perpetrator had used cement to kill the victim. He carefully examined Danny's body, noting where the cement had hardened. Shortly after, Griff arrived to assist with the investigation. Initially uninterested, Spencer decided to take charge, seeing an opportunity to advance his career as murders were rare. He quickly made calls to implement his plan for promotion. Griff and the other officers were displeased with Spencer's opportunistic behavior. Meanwhile, Griff discovered a message near Danny's body implicating Jimmy as the killer. Despite this, Griff kept this information to himself, not revealing Jimmy's involvement to anyone. Spencer, driven by his ambition to crack the case, continued his investigation at Terry's bar, where Danny had previously been. He approached Debs, the female bartender, expressing his desire to review the surveillance footage regarding the recent murder case involving a patron of the bar. It emerged that Terry had called the police out of concern for the frequent appearance of a group of robbers at his establishment. Debs seemed to disagree with Terry's decision to involve the police in checking the surveillance cameras. Terry explained that he simply wanted to make his bar safer by preventing gangs of robbers from causing trouble. As Terry and Debs conversed, Spencer sought permission to review the surveillance footage around the bar. While examining the footage, Spencer spotted a man forcing someone into the back of a car in the parking lot. Suspecting this man, Spencer asked the bar to zoom in on his face, confirming that Jimmy was the one responsible for Danny's murder. With all the evidence processed, Spencer wasted no time. The next day, the police arrived at Jimmy's apartment to arrest him. However, Jimmy had just returned and quickly drove off towards Morgan's house to seek refuge. Unable to locate Jimmy at his apartment, the police went to Morgan's house. They informed her that her husband was a suspect in a recent series of murders. The police left her a business card, urging her to call if she knew Jimmy's whereabouts. After the police departed, Morgan was furious with Jimmy, unaware that her husband was a murderer. They argued as his actions were unlawful. Throughout the afternoon, Jimmy remained at Morgan's house to evade the police. They spoke quietly about the situation. Jimmy attempted to reassure Morgan, promising to wrap up his affairs swiftly and then start anew together. However, he insisted they stay apart until his revenge scheme was complete. Saddened by this, Morgan hoped for his safe return soon. As a fugitive, Jimmy avoided drawing attention and kept interactions minimal. While at a convenience store buying necessities, 2 police officers recognized him. Jimmy attempted to flee, slipping out through the back door of the store. Meanwhile, Spencer received word of Jimmy's possible location and hurried to the scene. He instructed the police to apprehend Jimmy upon sight. As Jimmy quietly exited through the back door, he found himself in a narrow alley. Suddenly, he encountered a police officer who had recognized him earlier. Before Jimmy could respond, a van pulled up, and 2 burly men emerged, assaulting the officers until they were unconscious. Thinking the men were hostile, Jimmy aimed his gun at them, and they drew their weapons in response. At that moment, a middle-aged man stepped out of the van and ordered his men to lower their guns. Jimmy was surprised to recognize the man as Colonel Leach, his former leader from his time in Afghanistan. Shortly after, Jimmy climbed into the van and found himself face to face with Leach. He hadn't anticipated meeting Leach there. To his surprise, Leach explained that he wanted Jimmy to return to Afghanistan as a soldier. Leach emphasized the importance of being ready for duty at any time. However, Jimmy declined, stating he had personal matters to attend to first. Despite Leach's attempts to persuade him, Jimmy insisted on leading a normal life. Leach argued that Jimmy's unique skills set him apart from others, but Jimmy remained firm. Leach agreed to give him 2 days to resolve his personal issues before returning to Afghanistan. Meanwhile, Spencer arrived at the location where Jimmy was spotted earlier, only to find the 2 officers who had seen Jimmy were badly injured, leaving him disappointed. Meanwhile, Griff encounters James, a colleague of Jimmy's, while on duty in Afghanistan. Knowing that Spencer bribed James to capture Jimmy, Griff tries to persuade James to let Jimmy go. However, James insists on doing his job and apprehending Jimmy. Griff explains that if Spencer succeeds in catching Jimmy, he'll be promoted to police inspector. Griff expresses his reluctance for Spencer to gain more power, which could tarnish the police's reputation. He urges James to halt his pursuit and release Jimmy. After their conversation, Griff departs, leaving James to ponder his words. Meanwhile, Spencer arrives at a restaurant for a meal, but is unexpectedly approached by a journalist named Julia who brings up Jimmy's murder case. Annoyed by her presence, Spencer quickly leaves the restaurant. In the evening, Ryan was enjoying himself at a bar when he received an envelope containing a photo of the deceased Danny. Terrified, especially after spotting Jimmy watching him, Ryan decided to flee the bar, with Jimmy in pursuit. Attempting to escape, Ryan was chased by Jimmy in a car. However, he was trapped in a dead-end alley blocked by a fence. Jimmy then assaulted him until he lost consciousness and proceeded to take him away. Upon waking, Ryan found himself tied to a car by his hands and feet. Terrified, Ryan apologized to Jimmy for his past mistakes, but Jimmy paid no heed and proceeded with his plan to kill him. After attaching Ryan's body to the car with an iron, Jimmy drove off, causing Ryan's death. Once he realized Ryan had died, Jimmy detached the chain from his car before departing the scene. The next morning, Spencer met with his boss on a bridge, discussing the ongoing case. His boss emphasized the importance of solving the case. Later, Spencer sat in a coffee shop, pondering how to capture Jimmy. Meanwhile, Leach attempted to aid Jimmy, hoping to prevent him from remaining a fugitive. As Leach ordered coffee, he struck up a conversation with Spencer. However, Spencer, unfamiliar with Leach, didn't pay much attention to him. Nevertheless, Leach persisted, asserting that Jimmy was under his protection and Spencer should refrain from meddling with his people. However, Spencer insisted that Jimmy had committed crimes that warranted arrest. In response, Leach recounted a tale from their time together on the battlefield in Afghanistan, highlighting Jimmy's bravery and skill in thwarting a Taliban attack. He warned Spencer not to disrupt Jimmy's life, emphasizing Jimmy's status as a highly trained soldier. Despite Leach's warning, Spencer remained determined to achieve his ambition of becoming a police inspector. He declared his intent to arrest Jimmy regardless. Annoyed by Spencer's persistence, Leach warned of consequences if he continued to pursue Jimmy. In a large meeting attended by Police Commissioner Shields, Inspector Wales, and led by Commander Carter, a document concerning Jimmy was presented. Commander Carter urged the police officials to drop the case against Jimmy, stating that he was a member of the Special Air Service, a crucial asset due to his combat skills needed by the country. Carter explained his intention to reinstate Jimmy into the SAS, emphasizing their status as elite troops in England. When Shields inquired about Jimmy's superior, Carter declined to disclose that information, insisting it was unnecessary for the police to know. Shields expressed disapproval of the request, citing Jimmy's involvement in serious crimes. However, Carter insisted that the police must release him. In the evening, Rob was walking home to his apartment when suddenly, Jimmy approached him, brandishing a gun. Jimmy then compelled Rob to accompany him to Caleb's apartment. Upon reaching Caleb's place, Jimmy used Rob as a shield while he shot Rob and Caleb's associates. Jimmy also fatally shot Caleb's girlfriend, who attempted to defend herself with a shotgun. With Caleb still alive, Jimmy bound him to a chair and prepared a container of acid. He coerced Caleb into revealing the password to his safe. After looting Caleb's money and drug stash, Jimmy disposed of them by submerging them in acid. Despite Caleb's futile attempts to intervene, Jimmy proceeded with his grim task. Finally, he poured the acid onto Caleb's head, resulting in Caleb's death. The following day, Spencer summoned Griff to his office to confront him. Upon Griff's arrival, Spencer accused him of colluding with Jimmy in the string of murders, pressuring Griff to divulge Jimmy's next target. However, Griff vehemently denied Spencer's allegations, which only aggravated Spencer further. Consequently, Griff was ousted from the team investigating Jimmy's murders. Spencer emphasized his disapproval of anyone emulating Jimmy's tactics. Unfazed, Griff shrugged off Spencer's decision and even dared him to apprehend Jimmy. Fed up, Griff stormed out of the room. Despite Griff's defiance, Spencer grew increasingly determined to swiftly resolve Jimmy's case. In a newspaper office, the chief editor, Alex, instructs senior journalist Julia to write an article about the Jimmy case. Julia's story portrays Jimmy not as a murderer but as a local hero who has rid the community of troublesome criminal gangs. This angers Spencer as it undermines his efforts to solve the case, causing frustration as pressure from his superiors mounts. Desperate to advance his career by solving the Jimmy case, Spencer visits Rob in the hospital, recovering from the shootout at Caleb's place. Spencer urges Rob to search Jimmy's house for evidence that could incriminate him. With Spencer's assistance, Rob leaves the hospital and breaks into Jimmy's house. Among the findings are photos of Jimmy during his time in Afghanistan and stacks of letters addressed to him. Among these letters, Rob discovers a home address, which he believes may be Jimmy's next target, prompting him to head there. Later, after visiting the address, Rob finishes a drug deal and returns to his car. As he sits in the car, smoking the drugs he just obtained, Jimmy suddenly appears in the car, pointing a weapon at him. Jimmy instructs Rob to drive to a secluded spot. With no other option, Rob complies with Jimmy's demand. They arrive at a quiet riverside location, where Rob stops the car. There, Jimmy holds Rob hostage and administers a toxic chemical into his body, causing internal damage. Before injecting the substance, Jimmy asks Rob if he has any final words. However, Rob responds with curses and spits, angering Jimmy, who then beats him. Despite the beating, Rob continues to taunt Jimmy and insists on opening the back of the car, where he reveals a shocking sight: Morgan's lifeless body. Seeing Morgan's body, Jimmy is overcome with grief and rage. Blaming Rob for her death and the deaths of those he loved, Jimmy shoots Rob dead in retaliation. Shortly after, armed police officers led by Spencer surrounded Jimmy at the scene. Spencer urged Jimmy to drop his weapon and surrender peacefully to avoid any harm. Meanwhile, Griff arrived and was shocked to find Morgan's lifeless body in the trunk of a car. Angered by Spencer's actions, Griff accused Spencer of orchestrating the chaos by aiding Rob's escape from the hospital to lure Jimmy out, which ultimately led to Morgan's death. Griff pressured Spencer to confess, and eventually, Spencer admitted to releasing Rob to frame Jimmy. However, Spencer defended his actions, arguing that Griff's failure to apprehend Jimmy as the murderer forced him to take drastic measures. Upon hearing Spencer's confession, one of the leaders of the armed police instructed his team to lower their weapons. He expressed disappointment in Spencer's unethical tactics to advance his career by catching a murderer. As a result, all the officers decided to let Jimmy go free. Spencer, bewildered by this unexpected turn of events, was left puzzled as the armed police chose not to arrest Jimmy as planned. Frustrated and unwilling to accept his failure to apprehend Jimmy and secure a promotion, Spencer attempted to attack Jimmy with a gun borrowed from one of the armed officers when Jimmy's guard was down. However, Jimmy quickly anticipated Spencer's move, turned, and aimed a gun at him. He subdued Spencer and left the scene. In the final scene of the movie, the nighttime atmosphere of London is depicted. A pregnant woman steps outside her house to dispose of garbage in a nearby alley. Suddenly, two thugs appear and cover her mouth to silence her. Just then, Jimmy arrives to rescue her. The fearless thugs warn Jimmy against interfering in their activities. Despite their threats, Jimmy remains undeterred, calmly smiling in response. So the moral of the story is, if you mess with someone's parents, be ready to face their military-trained son on a mission for revenge, because family bonds are stronger than any bad guy gang.